The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat curled in her favorite armchair with a steaming cup of tea. The house felt unusually quiet without the children's laughter echoing through the halls. George was at school, Charlotte was at her music lesson, and little Louis was napping upstairs. These rare moments of solitude had become precious to her, especially during the challenging months that had tested their family strength. She glanced at her phone, noting it was barely past 2 in the afternoon. William wasn't expected home until evening. He had mentioned something about meetings running late and possibly staying in London overnight. The thought didn't bother her as much as it once might have. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to the unpredictable nature of royal duties, the way they could stretch a day into something unrecognizable. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made her pause mid-sip. It was too early for any scheduled visitors, and their security team usually gave advance notice of any changes. Catherine set down her cup and moved to the window, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could make out the familiar outline of William's Range Rover pulling into their private driveway. Her heart did a small skip, not from excitement, exactly, but from something more complex, a mixture of surprise, concern, and an emotion she couldn't quite name. In their 15 years together, William had rarely arrived home unexpectedly, especially not in the middle of a weekday afternoon. Royal schedules were planned months in advance, carved in stone, and guarded by private secretaries who treated spontaneity like a dangerous disease. Catherine watched as William sat in the driver's seat for several long moments, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. Even from this distance, even through the rain and the tinted windows, she could sense something was different about him. His shoulders seemed to carry a weight she hadn't seen before, and he made no move to get out of the car. It was as if he was gathering courage for something, or perhaps trying to leave something behind in that vehicle before entering their home. Finally, he emerged, and Catherine's breath caught in her throat. William looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. His usually perfect posture was slightly hunched, his stride less confident than the purposeful walk she knew so well. He wore his navy suit, the one he put on that morning with his usual careful attention to detail, but now it seemed wrinkled, lived in, as if the day had been longer and harder than anyone could have anticipated. She stepped away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities. Had something happened to the king? To Queen Camilla? Was there a crisis she hadn't heard about? Her phone hadn't buzzed with any emergency notifications, and surely someone would have called if there was a family emergency. But then again, sometimes the most important news came without warning, delivered in person rather than through the cold efficiency of a phone call. The front door opened with its familiar creak, a sound they'd grown to love because it meant home, safety, family. Catherine smoothed her casual clothes self-consciously, suddenly, aware that she was wearing her favorite worn jeans and an old cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She had planned to change before William returned, to put on something more presentable, but there hadn't been time to prepare for this unexpected homecoming. "Catherine," William's voice called out, and she heard something in it that made her stomach tighten with worry. It wasn't the warm greeting she usually received, nor was it the tired but affectionate tone of a man happy to be home. Instead, it carried an undertone of uncertainty, as if he wasn't quite sure how to begin whatever conversation was coming. "I'm in here," she called back, moving toward the living room doorway. She wanted to meet him halfway, to close the distance between them both physically and emotionally. As his footsteps approached, Catherine found herself holding her breath, preparing for whatever news or revelation had brought her husband home in the middle of the day. When William appeared in the doorway, Catherine's heart clenched. Up close, she could see the strain around his eyes, the way his jaw was set in that particular pattern that meant he was struggling with something significant. His hair, usually so carefully styled, looked as if he had run his hands through it repeatedly. Most telling of all, he hadn't smiled when he saw her, something that had become as natural as breathing in their years together. "You're home early," she said softly, keeping her voice neutral and welcoming. She had learned over the years not to bombard him with questions immediately, especially when he looked like this. Sometimes William needed a moment to find his words, to figure out how to translate whatever was happening in his head into something he could share with her. "I needed to be here," he replied, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. Instead, he looked around their living room as if seeing it for the first time, taking the family photos scattered across the mantelpiece, the children's artwork still displayed on the refrigerator visible through the kitchen doorway, the comfortable chaos of a home where 3 young children lived and played and grew. Catherine waited, recognizing the signs of a man wrestling with something important. She had seen this before, though not often. William was usually so controlled, so careful with his words and emotions. But occasionally, something would crack that careful exterior, and she would catch a glimpse of the man behind the prince, the father behind the future king, the husband behind the public figure. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently, moving closer to him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." William finally looked directly at her, and Catherine saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. It wasn't grief exactly, but it was something profound and unsettling. It was the look of a man who had just realized something important about himself, about his life, about the path he was walking. It was the look of someone who had just been forced to confront a truth he had been avoiding. "I left early," he said simply, as if that explained everything. But Catherine knew it explained nothing at all. William didn't leave early. He didn't abandon responsibilities or walk away from commitments. Even when he was sick, even when the children needed him, even when she needed him, he fulfilled his duties first and dealt with personal matters second. It was how he had been raised, how he had been trained, and how he had lived his entire adult life. Why? The question slipped out before Catherine could stop it, but she didn't regret asking. If William had broken his most fundamental rule about duty and responsibility, something significant had happened. William moved to the couch and sat down heavily, his head falling into his hands. Catherine had seen him tired before, had seen him frustrated and overwhelmed by the weight of his position. But this was different. This was a kind of emotional exhaustion that went deeper than anything physical or even mental. This was the exhaustion of a soul that had finally reached its limit. "I was sitting in that meeting room," he began, his voice muffled by his hands, "listening to them talk about schedules and appearances and the next royal tour. They had charts, Catherine, actual charts showing how to maximize our impact, how to schedule our lives for the next 6 months down to the quarter hour." Catherine sat down beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough away to give him space to breathe, to think, to feel whatever he was feeling. She had attended some of those meetings herself, had seen the machinery of royal life up close. It could be overwhelming even for someone who had been born into it, let alone someone who had married into it. "And then what happened?" she prompted gently. William lifted his head and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of confusion, sadness, and something that might have been panic. They started talking about Lewis's first day at prep school next year. They had already scheduled it, Catherine. They had scheduled our son's first day at school around a ribbon-cutting ceremony and a hospital visit. They had it all planned out, how long we could stay, when we would need to leave, how to make it look like we were present, and engage parents while still meeting our royal obligations. The words hung in the air between them, and Catherine felt her own heart sink. She hadn't known about this planning, hadn't been consulted about their youngest child's milestone being treated like just another item on the royal calendar. The thought of Lewis's nervous little face on his first day at school, looking around for his parents who might have to leave early for a ribbon cutting, made her feel sick. "That's when I realized I couldn't do it anymore," William continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't sit there and pretend that our children's lives were secondary to royal duties. I couldn't nod and smile and agree to miss another first day of school, another school play, another bedtime story because of an obligation that some committee decided was more important than being present for our family." Catherine reached for his hand, and he gripped it tightly, as if she were anchoring him to something solid in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. She understood now why he had come home unexpectedly, why he looked like a man who had just walked away from everything he had been taught to value. "What did you do?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "I stood up," Williams said, and for the first time since he had walked through the door, she heard a note of something that might have been pride in his voice. "I stood up in the middle of their presentation about maximizing our royal impact, and I told them I needed to go home to my family. I didn't ask permission. I didn't wait for them to reschedule or rearrange. I just left." The significance of this simple act wasn't lost on either of them. William had never just left a royal engagement or meeting. He had been raised to believe that duty came before everything, before comfort, before convenience, before personal desires, and, yes, even before family. The fact that he had walked away from a room full of advisors and private secretaries to come home to his wife and children represented a fundamental shift in his priorities. "They'll be angry," Catherine said softly, though she wasn't sure if it was a question or a statement. "They're already angry," William replied with a laugh that held no humor. "My private secretary called 3 times before I made it to the car. I finally turned my phone off." Catherine tried to imagine the chaos William had left behind. The scrambling assistants, the rescheduled meetings, the carefully planned royal machine grinding to a halt because one of its most important pieces had simply walked away. It would have been unprecedented, shocking, and probably terrifying for people whose job it was to keep the royal family functioning smoothly. But as she sat there holding her husband's hand, listening to him describe the moment he had chosen family over duty, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Hope that they might be able to find a way to be both royal and human. Hope that their children might grow up with parents who were present for the moments that mattered. Hope that she and William might be able to build the kind of marriage and family they had dreamed of before the weight of the crown had settled so heavily on their shoulders. "I'm proud of you," she said simply, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "It took courage to do what you did today." William looked at her with surprise, as if he had expected her to be angry or worried about the consequences of his actions. "You're not upset? About the meetings I've probably ruined, the schedules I've disrupted?" Catherine smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. "The schedules will survive. The meetings can be rescheduled. But this moment, right now, with you choosing to be here with us, this is what matters. This is what our children will remember." As if summoned by the mention of children, they heard Louis's voice calling from upstairs, his afternoon nap apparently over. William's face brightened for the first time since he had walked through the door, and Catherine saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with. Not the prince, not the future king, but the father who lit up at the sound of his children's voices. "Go to him," Catherine said gently. "Be present. Be here. Everything else can wait." William stood up, and she could see some of the tension leaving his shoulders. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a gesture so tender and grateful that it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for understanding, for not making me feel guilty about choosing this." "You should never feel guilty about choosing your family," Catherine replied firmly. "We're not just royal obligations, William. We're your life. We're what matters most." As William headed upstairs to their youngest son, Catherine remained on the couch, processing everything that had just happened. She knew there would be consequences for William's spontaneous departure from his royal duties. There would be difficult conversations with private secretaries, possibly even with the king. There would be questions about reliability and commitment to duty. But for the first time in months, Catherine felt like they were moving in the right direction. William's unexpected homecoming hadn't just been about leaving a meeting early. It had been about choosing a different kind of life, one where family came first and royal duties, while still important, didn't consume everything that mattered. She could hear William upstairs, his voice mixing with Louis's delighted giggles, and she smiled. This was what home was supposed to sound like. This was what love looked like when it was allowed to flourish without the constant pressure of royal expectations. Catherine picked up her phone and sent quick messages to George and Charlotte's schools, letting them know that their father would be home for dinner tonight and asking if the children might be able to come home a little early. She wanted this unexpected gift of time together to extend to their whole family, wanted all of them to benefit from William's moment of courage in that meeting room. As she waited for responses, Catherine found herself thinking about the future, not the carefully planned royal future that had been mapped out for them, but the real future they could build together. A future where unexpected homecomings were possible, where family moments weren't scheduled around ribbon cuttings, where they could be both royal and human without having to choose one over the other. The rain had stopped while they talked, and autumn sunlight was streaming through the windows, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. Catherine took it as a sign that they were moving towards something better, something more authentic than the life they had been living. When William came back downstairs with Louis in his arms, both of them grinning and covered in the remnants of what appeared to be an impromptu pillow fight, Catherine felt her heart swell with love and gratitude. This was worth any amount of royal displeasure. This was worth the difficult conversations and rescheduled meetings that would certainly follow. This was their real life, finally, taking precedence over their royal life. And Catherine had never been more proud of her husband than she was in that moment when he chose to come home without warning. The next morning arrived with an uncomfortable intensity that Catherine felt before she even opened her eyes. William's phone had been buzzing incessantly since 5 in the morning, despite being on silent mode. The vibrations against the bedside table created a rhythmic disturbance that neither of them could ignore, though both pretended to still be asleep. Catherine could sense the tension radiating from William's still form beside her, could practically feel him calculating how much longer he could delay facing the consequences of yesterday's unprecedented decision. When the house phone began ringing at 6:30, Catherine knew the pretense was over. William's private secretary never called the house phone unless it was absolutely urgent, and given yesterday's events, this call was inevitable. William groaned softly and rolled toward her, burying his face in her shoulder as if he could hide from the responsibilities waiting for him. "I have to answer it," he mumbled against her neck, his breath warm and his voice thick with sleep and reluctance. "Not yet," Catherine whispered back, wrapping her arms around him. "Give yourself 5 more minutes of being just a husband and father. The prince can wait 5 more minutes." They lay there in the early morning light, holding each other while the phone continued its insistent ringing. Catherine could feel William's heart beating fast against her chest, could sense the internal struggle between the man who wanted to stay in this bed with his wife and the royal heir who had been trained never to ignore his duties. Finally, the ringing stopped, leaving them in silence that felt both peaceful and ominous. Catherine knew it was only temporary. Within minutes, there would be cars in their driveway, assistants at their door, and the full weight of the royal machinery demanding William's attention and explanations. "I keep thinking about something," William said quietly, his voice barely audible even in the stillness of their bedroom. "Yesterday, when I walked out of that meeting, it felt like I was finally doing something right for the first time in months. But now you're second-guessing yourself," Catherine finished for him, understanding completely. This was the burden of being born into duty. Even when you made the right choice for your family, years of conditioning made you question whether personal happiness was worth the professional chaos it might create. "The thing is," William continued, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look at her properly, "I'm not sorry I did it. Even knowing what today is going to bring, even knowing how angry everyone is going to be, I'm not sorry I chose to come home to you and the children." Catherine reached up to touch his face, running her thumb along the line of worry that had appeared between his eyebrows. "That tells you everything you need to know about whether it was the right decision." Before William could respond, they heard the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles arriving in their driveway. Catherine glanced at the clock, 7:15 in the morning. The royal machine had arrived to reclaim its missing piece. "Mama," Papa. Charlotte's voice called from down the hallway, followed by the sound of small feet padding across the wooden floor. There are lots of cars outside. William sighed deeply and sat up, running his hands through his hair in the gesture Catherine had learned meant he was steeling himself for something difficult. I should go down and face whatever committee they've sent to drag me back into line. We should go down, Catherine corrected gently but firmly. This affects our whole family, and I'm not letting you handle this alone. The gratitude in William's eyes was so intense it made Catherine's chest tight with emotion. She realized how many times over the years he must have faced difficult situations alone, shouldering the burden of royal expectations without anyone to share the weight. But not today. Today, she would stand beside him and remind everyone present that he wasn't just a prince. He was a husband and father with responsibilities that went beyond the crown. They dressed quickly and quietly, both choosing clothes that struck a balance between casual and appropriate for receiving royal officials. Catherine selected a simple navy dress that made her feel confident and put together, while William opted for dark trousers and a crisp white shirt without a tie, dressed respectfully, but not formally, sending a subtle message about the kind of conversation he was prepared to have. As they headed downstairs, George appeared at the top of the staircase, his hair still messy from sleep, but his eyes alert with curiosity. "Why is the driveway full of cars?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight concern that came with being old enough to understand that unexpected official visits were rarely good news. "Your father needs to have a meeting with some people from work," Catherine explained calmly, moving to give their eldest son a reassuring hug. "Nothing to worry about. Why don't you help me make breakfast for everyone while Papa talks to them?" George nodded, accepting the explanation with the easy trust of childhood. But Catherine caught the look he exchanged with William, a moment of understanding between father and son that spoke to George's growing awareness of the complexities of their family's public life. The doorbell rang just as they reached the bottom of the stairs, followed immediately by a firm knock that managed to sound both respectful and impatient. William paused with his hand on the door handle, taking a deep breath that seemed to transform him from the worried husband and father he had been upstairs into the composed royal heir everyone expected to see. Catherine watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and sadness. She had seen it countless times over the years, but today it struck her differently. Today, she saw how much effort it took, how much of his authentic self William had to suppress in order to become the version of himself that royal duty demanded. "Remember," she whispered, touching his arm gently, "you don't have to become someone else to handle this. They need to work with who you really are, not who they want you to be." William's smile was grateful and slightly surprised, as if this thought hadn't occurred to him. He squeezed her hand once and opened the door to reveal a delegation that was both impressive and intimidating in its scope and seriousness. Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, stood at the front of the group, his expression carefully neutral, but his presence making it clear that yesterday's events had escalated to the very top of the royal hierarchy. Behind him were William's own private secretary, looking haggard and stressed, and two other officials Catherine recognized but couldn't name. The fact that they had all arrived together, this early in the morning, spoke volumes about how seriously the palace was taking William's unprecedented departure from duty. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Sir Clive said formally, his tone polite but noticeably cooler than usual. "I apologize for the early hour, but I'm sure you understand the urgency of the situation." "Of course," William replied, and Catherine heard him slip into his most diplomatic voice, pleasant, controlled, and completely devoid of the personality she had been talking to upstairs. "Please come in." As the group filed into their living room, Catherine noticed how their presence immediately changed the entire atmosphere of the house. The comfortable lived-in space where their family relaxed and played suddenly felt formal and unwelcoming, as if the official nature of the visit had sucked all the warmth out of the room. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Sir Clive suggested, his eyes moving meaningfully toward Catherine and then toward the kitchen, where the sounds of the children beginning their morning routines were clearly audible. "My wife will be joining us," William said firmly, and Catherine felt a surge of pride at the quiet strength in his voice. "This concerns our family, and she has every right to be part of the conversation." Sir Clive's eyebrows rose slightly, suggesting this wasn't the response he had expected or prepared for. "Your Royal Highness, with respect, this is a matter of your official duties and commitments. The Princess of Wales, while certainly important to the family, doesn't need to be involved in discussions about your professional obligations." The dismissive tone and the implication that she was somehow separate from or irrelevant to William's royal life made Catherine's cheeks flush with anger. She had spent over a decade fulfilling royal duties, supporting William in his role, and making sacrifices for the institution they all served. The suggestion that she shouldn't be involved in discussions about how those duties affected their family was both insulting and incredibly short-sighted. "Actually," Catherine said before William could respond, her voice calm, but with an edge of steel that made everyone in the room pay attention, "I think you'll find that discussions about Prince William's duties very much concern me. When you schedule his life without considering our family's needs, when you plan our children's milestones around ribbon cuttings, when you expect him to prioritize royal appearances over being present for his family, that affects all of us." The room fell silent, and Catherine could see the officials exchanging glances that suggested they were recalibrating their approach to this conversation. They had clearly expected to have a straightforward discussion with William about duty and responsibility, not to face a united front that challenged their assumptions about how royal families should operate. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Clive said, addressing Catherine directly for the first time since arriving, "I understand your concerns about family time, and certainly no one wants to interfere with your children's happiness. However, you must understand that Prince William's role comes with obligations that simply cannot be postponed or canceled because they're inconvenient for family schedules." "I'm not asking for anything to be canceled," Catherine replied evenly. "I'm asking for our family to be considered when these schedules are created, rather than treated as an afterthought that has to work around royal duties." William moved closer to Catherine, a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Yesterday," he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke, "I sat in a meeting where my son's first day at prep school was being planned around a hospital visit. Not coordinated with, not scheduled in consideration of, planned around. As if my being present for one of the most important moments in Lewis's young life was optional, but cutting a ribbon was mandatory." "Your Royal Highness," William's private secretary interjected, looking increasingly uncomfortable, "surely you understand that we were trying to maximize efficiency, to ensure you could attend both events." "No," William interrupted, and the force of the word made everyone in the room stop talking. "You were trying to manage me like a resource to be allocated rather than a father who wants to be present for his child. There's a difference, and it's a difference that matters." Catherine watched as the officials processed this unexpected pushback. She could see them struggling to reconcile their image of William as the dutiful, compliant heir with a man standing in front of them, clearly prepared to challenge their methods and priorities. "Perhaps," Sir Clive said carefully, "we could discuss ways to better integrate family considerations into the scheduling process. However, I must emphasize that certain commitments simply cannot be moved. The royal calendar exists for reasons that go far beyond personal convenience." "I'm not talking about personal convenience," William replied, his frustration finally breaking through his diplomatic facade. "I'm talking about being a present father and husband. I'm talking about modeling for my children that family relationships matter, that love and connection aren't luxuries to be fit in around work obligations. And I'm talking about your duty to the crown and to the people of this country," Sir Clive responded, his own composure starting to crack slightly. "Your role as Prince of Wales comes with responsibilities that millions of people depend on." Catherine felt the conversation reaching a dangerous turning point, where positions would become entrenched and productive dialogue would become impossible. She could see William's jaw setting in the way that meant he was preparing for a fight, and she could see the officials girding themselves for a battle over duty versus family that would help no one. "What if," she said quietly, interrupting the escalating tension, "we approached this differently? What if instead of talking about duty versus family, we talked about how to fulfill royal obligations in a way that strengthens rather than undermines the royal family?" Everyone turned to look at her, and Catherine took a deep breath before continuing. "The people of this country don't want to see Prince William sacrificing his children's happiness for royal duties. They want to see him being a good father who also happens to be a prince. They want to see a royal family that embodies the values they care about: love, dedication to family, being present for the people who matter most." She could see she had their attention now, could see them considering this perspective they hadn't expected to encounter. When Prince William misses Louis's first day of school for a ribbon cutting, what message does that send to other fathers? When royal duties consistently take priority over family moments, how does that reflect the monarchy's values? Sir Clive was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications of what Catherine had said. "You're suggesting that being present for family moments is itself a form of royal duty?" "I'm suggesting that being an authentic, engaged father and husband makes Prince William a better representative of the monarchy, not a worse one," Catherine replied. "People connect with real, human emotion and genuine family bonds. They want to see that the royal family shares their values, not that we're so different from them that we prioritize appearances over our children." William looked at her with an expression of amazement and gratitude, as if she had articulated something he had been feeling but couldn't find words for. "That's exactly right," he said, turning back to the officials. "My being present for my children, my prioritizing my family, that's not a distraction from my royal duties. It's central to what kind of prince and eventually what kind of king I want to be." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a thoughtful silence rather than a tense one. Catherine could see the officials reassessing their position, considering how this perspective might actually serve the monarchy's interests rather than threatening them. "This is certainly a different approach than we've considered," Sir Clive said slowly. "And I can see the merit in ensuring that Prince William's public image reflects strong family values. However, there are still practical considerations about how to balance multiple commitments." "Of course there are," Catherine agreed. "And we're not suggesting that royal duties should be abandoned or ignored. We're suggesting that they should be planned and executed in a way that recognizes Prince William as a whole person with multiple important roles, not just as a royal function to be scheduled." As the conversation continued, Catherine felt something shifting in the room. The adversarial atmosphere was gradually being replaced by something more collaborative, more focused on finding solutions rather than defending positions. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when old assumptions and expectations surfaced to complicate the discussion, but progress was being made. By the time the officials left, nearly 3 hours later, they had agreed to a trial period of new scheduling approaches that would prioritize family milestones and build royal duties around them rather than the other way around. It wasn't everything Catherine and William had hoped for, but it was a significant step in the right direction. As the last car pulled out of their driveway, William sank onto the couch and looked at Catherine with an expression of exhaustion and relief. "I can't believe you did that," he said. "The way you reframed everything, made them see that being present for our family isn't selfish, but actually serves the monarchy better. That was brilliant." Catherine sat beside him and took his hand. "We did that," she corrected gently. "You started it yesterday, when you chose to come home. I just helped finish it." They sat together in the quiet of their living room, both of them processing what had just happened and what it might mean for their future. It felt like a victory, but Catherine knew it was just the beginning. Changing years of established patterns and expectations would take time and patience and probably several more difficult conversations. But for now, she was content to sit with her husband in their home, knowing that they had stood together when it mattered, knowing that they had advocated successfully for their family's needs, and knowing that William's unexpected homecoming yesterday had been the catalyst for a conversation that was long overdue. Outside, the morning was bright and clear, full of possibility and promise. Inside, their family was beginning a new chapter, one where love and connection would no longer be secondary to duty, where being present for each other would be recognized as its own form of service. It felt like the beginning of something important, something that would shape not just their family's future, but possibly the monarchy itself. And it all started with a prince who chose to come home without warning, and a wife whose reaction told the whole story of a marriage strong enough to challenge tradition for the sake of love. 3 weeks after the morning that changed everything, Catherine found herself standing in the kitchen of Amber Hall, their Norfolk residence, watching William help Louis with his homework at the large oak table that had become the heart of their family life. The scene was so wonderfully ordinary, a father patiently explaining long division to his youngest son while Charlotte practiced piano in the adjacent room, and George worked on a history project spread across the floor, that it still sometimes took her breath away. The changes hadn't come easily. The first week after William's confrontation with the palace officials had been particularly challenging, with a delicate dance of rescheduled appointments, carefully worded public statements, and private conversations with senior members of the royal family who weren't entirely convinced that William's new approach to balancing duty and family was wise or sustainable. The king himself had requested a private audience with William just 4 days after the morning meeting, and Catherine had spent those hours walking the grounds of their estate, her phone clutched in her hand, waiting for word about how the conversation had gone. When William returned, he looked drained but determined, reporting that his father had been surprisingly understanding, even expressing some regret about the choices he had felt forced to make as a young father himself. He said he didn't want me to have the same regrets he carried. William had told her that evening as they sat together on their terrace, watching the sun set over the Norfolk countryside. He said that being king was important, but being a good father was something you could never get a second chance at. Those words had given Catherine hope, but she knew that institutional change moved slowly, and there would be ongoing pressure to revert to the old ways of doing things. The true test would come not in grand gestures or heated meetings, but in the daily choices that shaped their family's life. The first real test had come just a week later, when a major charity patron wanted to schedule a last-minute appearance that conflicted with George's school sports day. In the past, such a request would have been accommodated automatically, with family events being moved or missed to make room for royal obligations. This time, William's private secretary, clearly still adjusting to the new priorities, had called to discuss options. Catherine had listened from the kitchen as William took the call, his voice calm, but firm as he explained that he would not be missing his son's sports day, and that the charity appearance would need to be rescheduled or handled by another member of the royal family. When he hung up, he had looked at her with a mixture of pride and anxiety, clearly aware that each such decision was being watched and evaluated by people who weren't yet convinced this new approach would work. The sports day itself had been a revelation. Catherine had watched William cheer enthusiastically as George competed in the egg and spoon race, had seen him high-five their eldest son after a particularly good showing in the three-legged race, had noticed how George's face lit up every time he spotted his father in the crowd. The other parents had been delighted to see the future king so genuinely engaged in such an ordinary parental activity, and the photographs that appeared in the papers the next day had shown a side of the royal family that the public rarely got to see. "That's what we want people to see," Catherine had said as they looked at the newspaper coverage together. Not a prince fulfilling an obligation, but a father who's present for his child's important moments. But the real changes were smaller and more personal. William's new schedule meant he was home for dinner most nights, something that had been rare before. He was able to read bedtime stories more regularly, to help with homework, to participate in the countless small moments that made up the daily rhythm of family life. The children had adjusted to having him around more, with a happiness that was both touching and revealing of how much they had missed his presence. Catherine noticed the change in herself as well. The constant low-level anxiety she had carried about managing 3 children while William was frequently away had begun to ease. She felt less like a single parent who happened to be married and more like part of a true partnership. The division of labor in their household had become more equitable, and she found herself with more energy for the royal duties she did carry, knowing that the home front was being managed by both of them rather than primarily by her. But perhaps the most significant change was in William himself. The tension that had seemed to live permanently in his shoulders had begun to ease. He laughed more freely, engaged more fully with the children, and seemed to have found a way to be authentically himself, whether he was at a royal engagement or helping Louis build a Lego castle. The morning Catherine found herself reflecting on these changes, she was preparing for what would be their first major test as a family under the new arrangement. William was scheduled to undertake a 3-day tour of Scotland, his first extended royal duty since implementing their new approach to balancing family and royal obligations. The old William would have been gone for a week, with every moment scheduled and no flexibility for family contact beyond brief phone calls. The new arrangement included daily video calls with the children, a schedule that allowed for proper rest rather than maximum appearances, and a firm end time that would get him home in time for Charlotte's school concert on Friday evening. "Are you nervous?" Catherine asked as she watched William pack his overnight bag, taking care to include the small framed photo of their family that he had started carrying on all his trips. "Surprisingly, no," he replied, though she could see the slight tension around his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely as calm as he claimed. "I think I'm more nervous about whether this approach will actually work in practice, whether I could be effective as a royal representative while still maintaining the boundaries we've set." Catherine understood his concern. It was one thing to negotiate new arrangements in the abstract, quite another to implement them in the real world, where every choice would be scrutinized and evaluated. If this tour went badly, if William appeared distracted or uncommitted, it would give ammunition to those who argued that his new priorities were incompatible with royal duty. "You'll be more effective, not less," she said with confidence she genuinely felt. "When you're not exhausted and stressed about missing everything at home, when you know you're coming back to a family that feels prioritized and valued, you'll be able to engage more fully with whatever you're doing." William smiled and pulled her close, holding her in a way that had become more frequent since his decision to prioritize their family. "I hope you're right, because if this doesn't work, I'm not sure what our options are." The weight of that statement hung between them. They both understood that this new approach was something of an experiment, and that if it failed, the pressure to return to the old ways would be enormous. The stakes felt particularly high because they weren't just advocating for their own family's happiness, but potentially modeling a new way of approaching royal service that could influence how future generations balance duty and personal life. The night before William left for Scotland, they had dinner as a family at their kitchen table, something that had become a cherished ritual in recent weeks. George regaled them with stories from his science class. Charlotte showed off a new song she had learned on the piano, and Louis insisted on demonstrating his improving reading skills by reading the dinner menu he had written himself. Catherine watched William engage fully with each child, asking thoughtful questions, offering encouragement, and clearly storing up these moments to carry with him during his time away. This kind of focused family time had been nearly impossible under the old schedule, where William was often distracted by the next obligation or exhausted from the previous one. "Papa, will you call us every day while you're gone?" Charlotte asked as they cleared the table together. "Every single day," William promised. "In fact, I'll call right before your bedtime, so we can say good night even when I'm not here. And you'll be back for my concert on Friday?" she continued, clearly needing reassurance that this important event wouldn't be sacrificed to royal duties. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," William replied firmly. "That's a promise, sweetheart." Catherine felt her chest tighten with emotion as she watched this exchange. Under the old system, William might have wanted to make such promises, but he wouldn't have been able to guarantee them. Royal schedules were considered inviolate, and family commitments were expected to be flexible. The fact that he could now make these commitments with confidence represented a fundamental shift in how their family operated. That evening, after the children were in bed, Catherine and William sat together in their sitting room, the fire crackling softly and a comfortable silence settling between them. She was working on some correspondence while he reviewed his briefing materials for the Scotland tour, but there was an intimacy to their shared quiet that had been missing during the constant rushing and scheduling of their previous life. "I've been thinking about what you said," William said suddenly, looking up from his papers. "About me being more effective when I'm not stressed about missing things at home. I think you might be right, but I also think there's more to it than that." Catherine set aside her letters and gave him her full attention. "What do you mean?" "I think when I was constantly choosing royal duties over family time, when I was missing bedtime stories and school events and quiet evenings like this, I was becoming disconnected from what actually matters to people. How can I represent families if I'm not present for my own? How can I speak authentically about the importance of community and connection if I'm sacrificing those things in my own life?" The insight struck Catherine as both profound and obvious, one of those truths that seemed clear once spoken, but hadn't been apparent before. "You're saying that being a good father and husband makes you a better prince?" "Exactly. When I'm grounded in my real life, when I'm connected to my family and experiencing the same joys and challenges as other parents, I have something genuine to offer when I'm representing the crown. I'm not just fulfilling obligations. I'm sharing experiences and understanding that come from actually living the life I'm supposed to be representing." Catherine felt a surge of love and admiration for her husband, seeing how his thinking about his role had evolved and deepened. "I think that's what people respond to when they see you at Georgia's sports day or helping Lewis with homework. They see authenticity. They see someone who shares their values and priorities. And hopefully they see that the monarchy isn't separate from or superior to ordinary life, but connected to it and enriched by it," William added. "That's the kind of king I want to be someday. Someone who rules not from a distance, but from the heart of human experience." They talked until late that night about their hopes for how this new approach might influence not just their family, but the monarchy itself. They imagined a future where royal children grew up feeling secure in their parents' love and attention, where royal marriages were partnerships that thrived rather than duties that were endured, where the crown represented the best of human values rather than the sacrifice of them. When William left for Scotland the next morning, Catherine felt none of the usual anxiety that accompanied his departures. Instead, she felt confident that they were building something sustainable and authentic, something that honored both his duty to the crown and his commitment to their family. The first call from Scotland came that afternoon, right on schedule. Catherine gathered the children around her laptop as William appeared on the screen, clearly tired from his first day of engagements, but genuinely happy to see their faces. "How was your first day back to royal duties?" George asked with the seriousness of an 11-year-old who understood that this tour was important for reasons beyond the obvious. "It was good," William replied thoughtfully. "Different than before, though. I felt more present, more engaged with the people I was meeting. And knowing that I get to see your faces at the end of each day makes everything feel more meaningful." "Are you still coming to my concert on Friday?" Charlotte asked, clearly still needing reassurance. "Already confirmed with my schedule," William said with a smile. "I'll be there in the front row, probably embarrassing you by cheering too loudly." Charlotte giggled with delight, and Catherine felt her heart swell with gratitude for the changes that had made this promise possible. Over the next 2 days, the pattern continued. William called at bedtime each night, sharing stories from his engagements and listening to the children's accounts of their days. The press coverage of the tour was overwhelmingly positive, with commentators noting William's apparent ease and genuine engagement with the people he met. Most telling was a comment from one of the tour organizers who mentioned to a reporter that the Prince of Wales seemed more relaxed and authentic than he had in previous visits, more willing to linger in conversations and connect personally with the individuals he encountered. "It's as if he's found a way to be fully present when he's working," the organizer had said, rather than always seeming to have one foot out the door. Catherine knew that this was exactly what they had hoped for, that prioritizing family time would actually enhance William's effectiveness in his royal role rather than diminishing it. The early evidence suggested their instincts had been correct, but she also knew that one successful tour didn't prove the viability of their new approach. The real test would come on Friday evening, when William walked into Charlotte's school concert hall, having kept his promise to be present for one of his daughter's important moments. The test would be whether he could consistently make such moments a priority without sacrificing his effectiveness as a royal representative. As Catherine prepared for bed on Thursday night, William's last night away, she felt cautiously optimistic about what they were building. The changes hadn't been easy, and she knew there would be ongoing challenges as they continued to navigate the balance between duty and family. But for the first time in years, she felt like they were moving in the right direction, building a life that honored both their royal obligations and their human needs. Tomorrow, William would come home, and they would take another small step toward proving that royal service and family devotion didn't have to be competing priorities. Tomorrow, Charlotte would perform in her school concert with both her parents in the audience, and that ordinary miracle would represent everything they had been fighting for. As she drifted off to sleep, Catherine smiled, thinking about how much had changed since that afternoon when William came home without warning. His unexpected return had been the catalyst for a transformation that was still unfolding, still being tested and refined, but already showing promise of creating the kind of family life they had always wanted but never quite believed was possible within the constraints of royal duty. The journey was far from over, but they were finally on the right path. 6 months had passed since William walked through their door that rainy afternoon, and Catherine could hardly recognize the family they had become. As she stood at the kitchen window, watching William teach George how to properly kick a football in their back garden, while Charlotte attempted to choreograph a dance routine for Louis's entertainment, she marveled at how profoundly their lives had transformed. The changes had rippled far beyond their immediate family, creating waves that had reached the very foundations of how the monarchy approached the balance between public service and private life. What had begun as one man's decision to prioritize his son's school day had evolved into a broader conversation about modern royal duty that was being watched and evaluated not just within the palace walls, but by royal families around the world. The success of William's Scotland tour had been followed by a string of equally positive engagements, each one reinforcing the idea that a prince who was grounded in family life was more effective, not less, in his royal duties. The press had begun to notice the change in William's public persona, commenting on his increased ease and authenticity during official appearances. But it was the private transformations that meant the most to Catherine. The man who had once come home exhausted and distracted, mentally still caught up in the demands of his royal schedule, now arrived each evening present and engaged, ready to dive into homework help or bedtime stories or simply listening to the children's accounts of their days. The evening she found herself reflecting on these changes, the family was preparing for what had become a weekly tradition, Friday night dinners where they cooked together and shared the week's highlights and challenges. It was a simple ritual, but one that had become precious to all of them, a weekly anchor that guaranteed family time regardless of what else was happening in their lives. "Mama, can you help me reach the pasta?" Charlotte called from where she was standing on a step stool, trying to retrieve ingredients from the cupboard. At 9 years old, she had become quite the capable cooking assistant, taking pride in her contributions to their family meals. Catherine moved to help her daughter while keeping one eye on Louis, who was carefully washing vegetables at the sink with the intense concentration that 7-year-olds brought to tasks they considered very important. William and George were working together at the stove, the 11-year-old learning to brown onions under his father's patient guidance. "Remember, George, you want to hear them sizzling gently, not aggressively," William was saying, his hand resting lightly on their son's shoulder. "If they're cooking too fast, they'll burn before they caramelize." Catherine smiled at the scene. These cooking lessons had become as valuable as anything George learned in his formal education, not because he was destined to become a chef, but because they represented something that had been largely missing from William's own childhood. The presence of a father who had time to share knowledge and create memories in the ordinary moments of daily life. The transformation in their children had been perhaps the most profound of all. George, who had previously seemed to carry some of his father's tension and the burden of being the heir's heir, had become more relaxed and confident. Charlotte had blossomed in ways that Catherine attributed directly to having both parents consistently present and engaged. And Louis, their youngest, had never known the constant absence that his siblings had experienced in their earlier years, growing up instead with the assumption that both his parents would be available for the moments that mattered to him. "Papa, will you come to my rugby match next Saturday?" George asked as he stirred the onions. The question casual, but carrying the weight of a child who now expected his father to be present for important events rather than hoping for it against the odds. "Wouldn't miss it," William replied immediately. "What time does it start?" 10 in the morning, George said, grinning. "And it's against Eaton House, so it's going to be really competitive." Catherine felt the familiar surge of gratitude she experienced whenever she witnessed these exchanges. Under their old system, George might not have even asked, knowing that royal duties would likely take precedence. Now he asked with the confidence of a child whose father had consistently proven that family came first. "I'll be there cheering embarrassingly loudly," William promised, ruffling his son's hair. "And I'll probably be the most nervous person on the sidelines." "Why nervous?" Louis asked from his position at the sink, always interested in understanding the emotional dynamics of family interactions. "Because I want George to do well and have fun," William explained. "When you love someone and they're doing something important to them, you feel nervous because you want it to go perfectly for them." Catherine paused in her dinner preparations, struck by the simplicity and honesty of William's explanation. This kind of emotional availability and openness had become characteristic of the new William, the version of himself that had emerged when he stopped trying to compartmentalize his feelings and roles so rigidly. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the landline ringing, and Catherine saw William tense slightly before catching himself. Old habits died hard, and unexpected phone calls still triggered his instinct to expect a royal crisis that would require his immediate attention. "I'll get it," Catherine said, moving to answer the phone. The caller ID showed it was William's private secretary, but at 7:30 on a Friday evening, Catherine felt confident that whatever it was could wait until Monday unless it was truly urgent. "Good evening, Your Royal Highness," came the familiar voice of James, William's current private secretary, who had proven much more adaptable to their new approach than his predecessor. "I apologize for calling during family time, but I wanted to catch Prince William before the weekend to discuss a rather exciting opportunity." "Can it wait until Monday?" Catherine asked, glancing over at her family gathered around the stove, all of them engaged in the collaborative project of making dinner together. "We're in the middle of our Friday evening family time." "Of course," James replied quickly. "I'll send a brief email with the details, and we can discuss it properly on Monday. Please give my regards to Prince William and tell him it's good news, not a crisis." Catherine hung up the phone feeling grateful for how much their relationships with palace staff had improved once everyone understood and accepted the new boundaries around family time. Initially, there had been resistance and confusion, but over time, most of the staff had come to appreciate having clearer expectations about when the Prince of Wales was and wasn't available for non-emergency matters. "Everything all right?" William asked, looking over from where he was helping Louis drain the vegetables. "James has some good news to share, but he agreed it could wait until Monday," Catherine replied. "He sends his regards and promises it's not urgent." William smiled, and Catherine could see his shoulders relax completely. 6 months ago, he would have felt compelled to take the call, would have spent the rest of the evening distracted by wondering what the news might be. Now, he trusted that truly urgent matters would be presented as such, and everything else could wait until business hours. "Good," he said simply. "Whatever it is will keep until Monday. Right now, I'm learning important culinary skills from my children. Dinner that evening was particularly special, filled with the kind of easy conversation and genuine laughter that had become the hallmark of their new family dynamic. They talked about George's upcoming rugby match, Charlotte's latest piano piece, Lewis's reading progress, and Catherine's plans for a garden renovation project she had been wanting to tackle for years, but never had the time or mental space to pursue. I had coffee with Sarah yesterday, Catherine mentioned as they cleared the table together, referring to one of her closest friends from university who had married into a much more conventional life. She said she's amazed by how happy you seem lately, William. She said you look like a completely different person than you did a year ago. William paused in loading the dishwasher, considering this observation. I feel like a different person, he said thoughtfully. Not different in my core values or my commitment to royal service, but different in terms of feeling like I could be fully myself in all aspects of my life. What do you mean? Charlotte asked, having overheard the conversation while she organized their recycling with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did. William turned to face their daughter, clearly taking her question seriously. I mean that before, I felt like I had to be one person when I was being Prince William and a different person when I was being Papa. Now I feel like I could be the same person all the time, someone who cares about serving our country and also someone who prioritizes his family. Is that better? Charlotte pressed, genuinely curious about the adult world she was beginning to understand more fully as she grew older. Much better, William said with a smile. When you can be authentic in all parts of your life, when you don't have to pretend or hide important parts of yourself, everything feels more honest and more sustainable. Catherine listened to this exchange with deep satisfaction, knowing that Charlotte was receiving an education about authenticity and work-life balance that would serve her well regardless of what path she chose in life. The children were learning by example that it was possible to have meaningful work and a strong family life, that one didn't have to come at the expense of the other. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and she and William were enjoying their customary cup of tea in the sitting room, Catherine found herself thinking about the broader implications of what they had accomplished. Do you ever think about how this might influence other royal families? She asked William, who was reading a biography of a former prime minister while she worked on some embroidery that helped her relax at the end of long days. All the time, he replied, setting down his book. I know there are other royal heirs around the world who are watching what we're doing, wondering if it's possible for them to make similar changes in how they approach duty and family. And what do you think the answer is? William was quiet for a moment, clearly giving the question serious consideration. I think the answer is that it has to be possible, because the alternative, sacrificing family relationships for royal duty, isn't sustainable in the modern world. People don't want to see royal families that are so focused on obligation that they lose sight of love and connection. Catherine nodded, thinking about the messages she had been receiving from other royal spouses around the world, women who were quietly asking for advice about how to navigate the competing demands of public service and private family life. The changes in their family hadn't gone unnoticed in royal circles, and there seemed to be a growing interest in whether their model could be replicated elsewhere. I think we're proving that royal service is actually enhanced when it comes from people who are grounded in strong family relationships, Catherine said. When you're present for your children, when you're a true partner in our marriage, when you're living the values you represent publicly, you have more to offer in your royal role, not less. Exactly, William agreed. And I think that a message that extends beyond royal families. Any parent who's trying to balance meaningful work with being present for their family can relate to what we've been figuring out. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet in the hallway, and Lewis appeared in the doorway, looking slightly embarrassed but determined. I had a bad dream, he announced matter-of-factly. Can I stay with you for a few minutes? Of course, sweetheart, Catherine said immediately, making room for him on the sofa between her and William. Under their old system, this kind of interruption might have been handled quickly and efficiently, with Lewis being comforted and returned to bed as soon as possible so that the adults could return to their important conversation or work. Instead, William set aside his book completely, and Catherine put down her embroidery, both of them giving Lewis their full attention as he described his dream about a dragon who was actually friendly, but everyone was afraid of because they didn't understand him. "That sounds like a very misunderstood dragon," William said seriously. "What do you think the dragon needed to help people see that he was friendly?" As Lewis considered this question and began spinning an elaborate story about the dragon's journey to prove his friendliness, Catherine reflected on how these spontaneous moments of connection had become some of the most precious parts of their family life. They were the moments that couldn't be scheduled, couldn't be planned, but could only happen when parents were truly present and available for their children's needs. Eventually, Lewis's story wound down, and he admitted he was ready to go back to bed. William carried him upstairs, and Catherine could hear them talking quietly in Lewis's room, William's voice gentle and reassuring as he helped their youngest son settle back to sleep. When William returned to the sitting room, he found Catherine putting away her embroidery and preparing for bed herself. "Thank you," she said simply as they turned off the lights and headed upstairs together. "For what?" William asked, genuinely puzzled. "For everything," Catherine replied. "For choosing to come home that day 6 months ago. For fighting for changes that seemed impossible. For becoming the husband and father I always knew you could be, but weren't sure you'd be allowed to be." William stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to face her, his expression serious and loving. "Thank you for believing it was possible when I wasn't sure myself. Thank you for standing with me when we faced all those officials who thought we were being unreasonable. Thank you for helping me see that being a good father and husband was actually central to being a good prince, not a distraction from it." They stood together in the quiet hallway of their home, surrounded by the evidence of their family's life. Children's artwork on the walls, school bags hanging on hooks, family photos documenting years of love and growth. It was a moment of perfect contentment, of recognition that they had successfully built something precious and sustainable. 6 months ago, when William had walked through their door in the middle of that rainy afternoon, Catherine's reaction had indeed told the whole story. Her immediate understanding that something significant had shifted, her instinctive support for whatever change was coming, her readiness to stand with him as they fought for a different way of living their royal life. Now, as they prepared for bed in the home they had made together, surrounded by the children they were raising with love and presence and authentic engagement, Catherine knew that the story her reaction had told was one of hope. Hope that it was possible to serve both crown and family with equal dedication. Hope that duty and love could strengthen rather than compete with each other. Hope that their children could grow up in a royal family that modeled the values they publicly represented. The journey hadn't been easy, and Catherine knew there would be ongoing challenges as they continued to navigate the evolving relationship between their public and private lives. But they had proven to themselves and to the world that it was possible to be authentically human while fulfilling royal obligations, possible to prioritize family while serving the crown, possible to build a marriage and raise children in an environment where love came first and everything else found its proper place around that central truth. As she fell asleep that night, Catherine smiled, thinking about the unexpected gift that William's unplanned homecoming had given their family. Sometimes the most profound changes began with the simplest decisions. A decision to choose love over obligation, to value presence over protocol, to believe that the best way to serve others was to first take care of the people who mattered most. Their story was far from over, but the foundation they had built was strong enough to support whatever came next. And that foundation was built not on duty or tradition or royal expectation, but on the simple, revolutionary idea that a family that loved each other well could serve the world better than one that sacrificed that love for the sake of appearances. It was a lesson worth sharing, a story worth telling, and a life worth living. And it all began with a prince who came home without warning and a wife whose reaction told the whole story of what was possible when love was allowed to lead the way.